My name's David Firman. I'm a plant scientist, both a physiologist and a pathologist, and I've spent my entire career working on potato, most of it at Cambridge University Farm.
My name is David Nally. I'm a human geographer with research interests on human-plant interactions and entanglements, with a particular interest in subsistence crises and the history of famines.
My name is Mukesh Kumar. I'm university lecturer in engineering department, basically looking at food supply chain as my research topic. And within food supply chain, I look at food sustainability and resilience.
So one of the big questions in the global food economy is this issue of waste, and depending on how you measure it, the figures are different depending on which organization you look at. But one figure that's been moved around in the global media a lot is that about a third of all human food is wasted. And some say there's enough embedded calories to feed an additional 2 to 3 million people from that wasted food. So I just wonder whether potato fits into that sort of cycle of wastage that seems endemic.
Yeah, so potato is one of the I think it's the second largest wasted commodity after the bread that we have in UK. Every day we almost waste around 6 million potatoes in UK. We throw it. Approximately in a year it costs around 230 million pound. So there are various figures lies around, but just we need to look at wastage. We need to actually define what wastage is. For company, wastage means completely different than a farmer. So let's look at the UK. In UK, we are looking at farm level. A hectare should produce around 100 tons of potatoes, but achievement of yield that we are looking at right now is around 55 tons. So farmers put all the resources to grow 100 tons per hectare, but they are only achieving 55 tons. So they are the waste of resources that we are looking at. Wastage also travel across the supply chain. It's not just from the farmers. We are looking at processors, even the retailers, and then going to multiple processed food that we eat. So wastage is a huge challenge. Again, it's come back to the point that we were talking about is about food security and potatoes, and its role of potatoes in food security in a couple of 100 years ago. Now, potato, we take it for such a granted that we just think it doesn't have any particular value. However, potato can provide enormous amount of nutrition to us. So, potato, when we are looking at wastage, we need to think about it's not just potato that we are wasting. We are also wasting resources that goes through it. Let's take example of water. So almost a kilogram of potatoes, approximately around 200 or more than 200 liters of water that goes into producing a kilogram of potatoes. In this world, when we are dealing with scarcity, climate change, droughts, it has become quite important that we should look at potatoes as a very valuable crop, and also think about not to waste it, but also thinking about how to conserve the water. For me, what I am interested in is looking at whether certain types of potatoes has certain waste profile. So if we have a potato with thick skin, we can peel it off more. So around 8% of the potato wastage happen because of peeling it off of the potato. So we need to think about if certain types of potato varieties which can create less wastage, that is much more useful. And also what kind of wastage we are producing.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely key thing, is what is the definition of waste? Yeah. Because you alluded perhaps to a very wide definition of waste, which would be the difference between the yield potential and the yield achievement. That's a very different sort of waste to perhaps the waste that most individuals would consider, which is the rotting of something in your cupboard or the throwing of it out because it's begun to sprout or gone beyond its best by date. Yeah. But they're both potentially ways in which you could classify waste. So I think that's important that we get a handle on that. And you mentioned things like peeling waste. Well, of course, you don't have to peel potatoes. They can be eaten with the skins, and in fact the skins contain the highest amount of vitamin C. But not everybody wants to eat them in that way, and for certain processes, you sort of need to peel them. So it's a complicated subject, but I think we're all agreed that it's an area of huge importance in terms of making the most of our resources. And you mention of water is interesting. So some of the research that we've done is looking at how to maximize the use of water, and looking at genetic differences in potatoes, how they respond to applied water. And there certainly are some small differences, but in terms of their response to increasing yield in relation to the amount of water applied, varietal differences are quite small. There are ways in which they can escape the risk of drought by their different habits, but the photosynthetic efficiency of different potato varieties in relation to water use is very similar.
And in our research, we understood that certain potato varieties takes longer time to grow, right? It means longer time resources being used. And if we are actually throwing that potato, we are throwing huge amount of potatoes. What is more interesting, that even in farming, there are lots of knowledge that exists that we are slowly losing that knowledge. So not putting potato crops or seeds on the slopes is one of the example that we don't need to put those slopes, because at those slopes, we don't need to grow those potato at those slopes because it affects the yield and the size as well. So how we can actually bring the best practices, even the old age practices in our farming, which can actually reduce these wastage or losses that we are looking at. At the factory level, that's very interesting. I was visiting few factories, not looking at just potatoes, but some beans and other types of product that is being frozen in those factories. Initially, when we went there, we were asked what's the wastage level that your factory has? And we were told there's no wastage. And
I think that's back to your definition of waste again.
Yes.
Because they are using everything.
Yes, and when we actually went there and we asked, we started calculating those wastage, what we found out, there are 26% of wastage. For the branding and reputation sakes, we're not going to mention that particular company. But on average, 16 to 26% of wastage happen in the factory level as well, where they call it natural waste.
But I think that these uses of byproducts of a processing manufacturing can actually be useful. So for example, potato starch can be used for packaging. And there is a lot in the media at the moment about plastic waste and that being an environmental issue. Well, potato may have something to offer here. It produces a biodegradable packaging in the form of starch. So one man's waste can be, used.
It's very interesting, if I may come in here, because I mean it does make us think about needs and wants within the global economy, because the kinds of things we're describing are historically quite recent. Consuming potatoes in the form of crisps, consuming potatoes in the form of French fries or chips. These are relatively new cultural modes of utilizing available calories. And a lot of them have grown up in the sort of the fast food industrial economy, where resources were valued quite low and they were seen as abundant. And we're now starting to reevaluate the way in which we produce and use available resources, which seems to me it's always a political question. It's not just a manufacturing question or a supply side question or a science question about what variety. It's all about how needs and wants are cultivated within a global society. Why do we prefer certain things irrespective of their ecological costs, planetary?
That's a really interesting point. And another aspect of that in relation to waste is actually the size of potatoes that we buy in the supermarket. Now, botanically, the potato produces a distribution of sizes. It's impossible for all of the tubers to be 100 grams or 20 grams, depending on what your aspiration is. But if you want to go and buy some potatoes for a salad, you want the small salad potatoes, you can, through agronomy and variety, produce more of those, but they're never all going to be exactly the size that you want. And, it's down to our sophisticated, I suppose, requirements.
And this is really important, because as we turn these things as a consumer preference, that consumer wants certain types of potatoes in certain size,
yes,
it actually creates lots of wastage.
It can do, but there are. I'm a bit more positive, Mukesh. That I think there are opportunities to utilize the whole crop, but it needs an appreciation, as David said, of the environmental cost of not doing that, and valuing the byproduct, I suppose, in an appropriate way.
What is encouraging in these years is like even children are getting really aware of climate change and whole sustainability issues becoming quite important. One of the key aspects, as you mentioned, David, is about circular economy, right? So using the waste of one particular process and bringing them into another product, which is actually becoming quite dominant in manufacturing supply chain. And governments and regulators are encouraging us. We are working towards that direction. However, still the question is, are we valuing potato to the importance level that it had before in the history? And are we just taking it for granted that potatoes are there and it will be always there? We don't need to worry about it.
That's an interesting point. So we talked earlier about the rather limited genetic diversity of potato that is widely used, and the fact that some of the varieties that we currently grow are more than 100 years old and still apparently fit for purpose, and the risks of that limited genetic diversity for exposure to disease. And maybe another element of that would be the risk of not being able to adapt to climate change, which is something that is increasingly of concern to people. I think the positives are that there is a huge genetic diversity available through wild species, that using modern breeding techniques we can introduce into the potatoes that we grow, both in the UK and in the rest of the world. It's been challenging. One of the reasons is potato is an autotetraploid, and breeding those varieties with 4 sets of chromosomes is very difficult, very complex. But the future for using modern technology, including perhaps using hybrid potato varieties, which would be analogous to some of the developments in corn that absolutely revolutionized yield, but also would allow some of the other adaptations for disease resistance, and I think perhaps interestingly, opportunities in relation to the nutritional quality of potato could be a really important avenue to pursue in the future. So I'm quite positive if the opportunities are there, but up to now we are existing on a quite a limited genetic base.
One of the things, if I may, that's sort of left out of that story and I think is important to insert back in is the role of peasant farmers, smallholders, who of course throughout history have been the storers of plant genetic diversity and who through seed saving and sharing have created the great biodiversity and the domestications before Europeans even arrived on the scene.
No, it's a very good point, David. And I was in Peru recently, where the people who live in the high regions have a really close connection to these varieties, and I think they're a hugely important resource. We have to appreciate, however, that in a way these are their potatoes, and there is an element of concern of them losing their intellectual property or resource at least. So that has to be dealt with in an appropriate way.
It's interesting that even that language of intellectual property, when we went back to the 17th century, it didn't exist, right? Because the flora and fauna of the world were commons.
Yes.
And no one thought much of Europeans acquiring food, yes. And the great Columbian exchange, the movements of cultigens back and forth across the Atlantic and so on. It was all done free through the commons. And now, of course, those same crops are exchanged globally, but for a price.
And it's only because the commercialization that has happened. And a particular end product that we look at, a particular kind of chips, particular kind of burger, it actually creates that kind of IP issues that even smallholder farmers are losing it. Future in terms of in this particular way of growing potato, I think is changing. And it's changing because, again, we are going through this fourth industrial revolution where connected system, robotics, sensors are becoming really, really important. And it's also these technologies are available. So one of the key things that when I talk about wastage, looks like, oh, it's a doomsday scenario. However, we have opportunity, as David, you were saying, is actually track these areas of wastage and find out the solutions that we can create, either through circular economy or creating a balance between demand and supply that we generally used to have. So I'm quite also opportunistic and optimistic in this area. So future area of research is also going about whole linking the data, bringing agri-tech technologies into the field, helping smallholders farmer, which will actually help.
I absolutely agree. I think the information technology opportunities will have a big role to play in this. That agriculture generally up until now has really taken very little advantage of the opportunities in IT, and I think there is a lot of work going on in that area, and it offers an opportunity to provide added value throughout the world for agricultural crops and potato in particular. So yeah, I'm glad you're optimistic as well, Mukesh.